This might be a little off topic for me, but I can't help but wonder, what do you think slasher movies and video games have in common?
Well, for one, Roger Ebert hated them both. They are both unusually heavily legislated against, eliciting moral panic from concerned parents and guardians regarding their presumably young audiences' exposure to gore and violence. Both are often misunderstood from the perspective of the academic canon. Both are widely financially successful, and yet neither are taken particularly seriously by cultural critics or academics. In short, both slasher movies and video games are widely perceived to be violent time wasters, to a degree misogynistic, and moreover, only deemed worthy by their adolescent male audiences. And despite how often this presumption is countered, it remains to be a wide association with both mediums. In my previous set of essays, Queering the Slasher, I introduced this series by examining why slasher movies, as well as the horror genre as a whole, were worthy of study from a specifically queer lens, citing several studies, statistics, and theories which supported this concept. And while I think I got my point across with material I provided, there continues to be a resistance to study certain subgenres and mediums of horror, whereas others, often those cited as elevated by non-horror savvy critics, are given plenty of critical engagement and academic inquiry. Elevated horror, also known as new horror, art house horror, or post-horror, is an eye-rolling term often used in new film criticism as a means of distinguishing horror texts which are smart and thoughtful from horror texts which are not, implying somewhat that the default setting for horror movies is unintelligent. In the era of elevated horror, critics seemingly refuse to engage with some horror, while lauding others as if the two aren't capable of functioning in very similar ways. The argument sometimes feels as if elevated horror is somehow more capable of delivering racial, queer, or economic readings, and yet the same cannot be said for texts like the Saw franchise or Friday the 13th examples. The same can be said about video games, specifically horror video games. While a few notable examples have left the gamer sphere and achieved a level of critical and academic recognition, notably the Resident Evil franchise and Silent Hill 2, others have been left behind, replicating the unintelligent quality of the slasher counterparts that might have inspired them.
So where does this subject of elevation become especially relevant, particularly in line with horror scholarship? First of all, let's talk canon.
The concept of canon is complex and debatably deeply limiting. Originally, canon, or canonical, was a term associated with literature that wider scholarship deemed as valid and fundamental. Classical literature is often cited when discussing what is canonical, with authors such as Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Kafka, Dostoevsky, and a myriad of others that we were all forced to read in high school. To quote Esther Lombardi, classic literature is an expression of life, truth, and beauty. It must be of high artistic quality, at least for the time of which it was written. This definition establishes a worrying assumption of low quality and indeed low art in regards to literature that we deem as non-canonical, and this assumption will be replicated as we continue to examine cinema and new media. When cinema was first beginning, a number of critics were sceptical of its legitimacy as a true and prestigious art form compared to works of theatre and literature, especially pre-Hays Code, coincidentally where horror really excelled. After all, the presumption is that it takes a lot more focus and drive to read a book or engage in a play than it does to watch a movie or play a game. In retaliation, several working film theorists, including Vachel Lindsay, Hugo Musterberg, Robert Grau, and Terry Ramsey, argued at the time that cinema was indeed an art form and a valuable one, and they cited several examples of early cinema such as Intolerance, The Night of St. Sylvester, and, interestingly, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, that would eventually be deemed as canonical in wider scholarship. These theorists believed that because certain cinematic pictures, certain mind you, not all, had academic value, that they were thoughtful, smart, and demonstrative of a specific directorial vision. They were artistic and, more importantly, canonical in the sphere of academia, and indeed in the sphere of politics. And over time, these classic pictures would eventually be deemed as canonical classics to cinema and still make up a significant amount of film scholarship today.
But where might the concept of canon be problematic?
Looking at the AFI and BFI 100 most important films lists, since the level of critical recognition and prestige is important in regards to canonizing a text, we already encounter a problem. Most of these texts are old, most of these texts are white, all of these texts are male, and I'm pretty sure that the critics that chose these films for these lists are probably the same. While I don't want to discredit the work done on these pictures, this vision only adds to the previous argument that what is often deemed as canonical is deeply restrictive, and therefore the scholarship surrounding these texts is as restrictive. When we have such a narrow scope of films that we properly deem as canon, as academically worthwhile, it's disheartening to look at this kind of list when your area of study is perhaps a work of a female director. Neither the BFI and AFI list have a single female director listed. Horror is a little better, since both lists commend Psycho and the AFI includes Frankenstein and the Silence of the Lambs, as well as countercultural, maybe queer classics Rebel Without a Cause and Cabaret. But comparing this to the number of angry old men pictures, war flicks and mafia pictures, the canonical gaze of cinema is again deeply restrictive. It's additionally frustrating when considering both lists only commend texts with critical recognition, when the Academy is notorious for snubbing both female directors, as well as directors of colour, and the entire horror genre. These canonical lists, as well as award shows, consistently ignoring the horror genre can lead to assumptions of horror only really being worthy when it's a thriller, a psychological crime drama, or when its name is already associated with a high degree of prestige and history.
So, from this concept, the overlap of elevated horror and canonical horror becomes even more evident.
The debate between elevated horror and more mainstream horror has always felt like somewhat of a battle, particularly back when slasher and exploitation horror were becoming hot topics in public cinematic discourse. Several horror theorists and critics, such as Robin Wood, Vera Dica, Barbara Creed and Carol J. Claver, came forward in defense of the more condemnable texts within the slasher genre, though not without their own criticisms, citing their successful releases and legacies as having proven their value and importance to the cinematic canon. However, despite this proof of academic value, there remains to be a strict distinction between these texts and the contemporary elevated texts. Though there are many discussions dismantling the concept of canon because of just how restrictive it is, and the term elevated horror seems to incite a groan and an eye roll from any horror fan, both terms are still widely associated with the concept of high art and quality in our cultural lexicon.
So what happens when we aren't motivated by what is canonical and what is elevated? What happens when we are able to examine even the most denigrated and contended texts through an academic lens?
Well, as I said back in Queering the Slasher, when we as audiences, academics, critics or fans are able to read meaningful subtext into these mediums, when we are able to recognise our own plights and struggles into the protagonists on screen, an undeniable nuance and importance is added to these texts and proves that they deserve a place in our cultural understanding of film and media studies. It proves that regardless of cultural canon, these texts have importance.
Alright, with all of that out the way, let's bring the conversation back to video games.
Video games have been a part of our cultural consciousness since the early 1980s, after the household availability of games consoles and video cabinets became worldwide and accessible. And much like cinema and slasher cinema before it, video games have come under a lot of scrutiny regarding their usefulness, their possible benefits, their problems in the eyes of respectable society, and, because it always comes back to this, their classification as a worthy art form. To me, games have consistently demonstrated their undeniable value as a form of new media. The Library of Congress has over 3,000 titles in their archive, and the consistent back and forth about video games functioning as a valid art form seems to be one of the more repetitive debates of the 21st century. Some are big supporters of the concept, others less so. As I previously mentioned, Roger Ebert was not a fan. He wrote in the now notorious blog post, "Video games will never be art." No one, in or out of the field, has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great poets, filmmakers, and novelists, and later adds painters, composers, and so on to the list of true artists. Personal bias against Mr. Ebert aside, and I absolutely have one, this echoes much of the same criticism that cinema once garnered, and additionally echoes his own criticism from 30 years before about the host of slasher movies that he couldn't stand.
These films hate women, and unfortunately the audiences that go to them don't seem to like women too much either.
Roger Ebert seems to haunt me no matter what I study, huh? At least he isn't saying that video games are misogynistic. Though maybe he should have.
The concept of video games only being appealing to adolescent boys comes from a Nintendo marketing strategy back in the 1980s, which would push video games consoles towards young boys, and many companies would follow suit with their advertising. But in a 2016 survey, it was shown that women make up a significant percentage of gamers, and in some countries, women actually make up the majority of gamers. Similarly, those identifying as LGBT+ make up almost a fifth of gamers, and gamers, or gay gamers, are a hugely vocal community of players in the gaming sphere. Much like horror and slasher slasher movies whose audiences are equally split between male and female, and who attract a significant percentage of gay moviegoers, gaming is very similar despite how often the opposite is presumed. When something, literature, cinema, horror movies, or video games, is so widely presumed to be a male-only space, the value of introducing different perspectives, indeed introducing queer perspectives to these texts, indicates not only an undeniable academic intrigue, but additionally a means for traditionalism and heterocentric cisnormative storytelling to be directly challenged. When we can openly acknowledge the values of new media like video games, we can examine these texts from different theoretical ideologies, e.g. sociological theory, feminist theory, queer theory.
So with all of these concepts introduced, it's time to introduce my case study.
Outlast is a survival horror game that was released in 2013 by Red Barrels, an independent company, much like the companies who funded slashers in their heyday, working in Montreal, Canada. Outlast Whistleblower was added the following year as downloadable content to the original game, and Outlast 2 was released late 2017 as an expansion of the ghoulish universe that was presented in the first game. In the remote mountains of Colorado, Mount Massive Asylum, a long-abandoned mental hospital for the mentally ill, has been recently reopened by the research and charity branch of the Murkoff Corporation, operating in strict secrecy. Acting on a tip from an anonymous source, journalist Miles Upshaw breaks into the facility, and what he discovers walks a terrifying line between science and religion, nature, and something else entirely. Once inside, his only hope of escape lies with the terrible truth at the heart of Mount Massive. The three games were widely praised at the time of each of their releases, with critics commending Red Barrels for Outlast's use of a foreboding atmosphere, its oppressive and labyrinthine setting, and its unique approach to presenting truly memorable scares. And even now, almost 7 years after the release of the first game, Outlast remains to be a classic gaming franchise amongst horror fans, and as highly regarded as contemporary classics such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Resident Evil 7, and Silent Hill 2.
Now, from a theoretical perspective, Outlast already interacts with several interesting facets of horror theory.
With each protagonist armed only with a video camera, the games essentially operate as found footage video nasties, much like Cannibal Holocaust, though the player interacts with the horror rather than just being an audience member watching through a voyeuristic lens. This in itself negotiates with the concept of video games being able to deliver horror more successfully than films do, because of the degree of interactivity and presentations of realism. There has been a desire to make horror films more immersive and real-feeling since the early 1950s and the first introduction of 3D horror movies, such as The House of Wax and It Came from Outer Space. Similarly, William Castle, the proud king of gimmicks, used props, shaking chairs, and illusions to enhance the frights of his films. Additionally, the appeal of haunted attractions, full-on scare actors, and spooky set dressing has been a common practice since 1915 with the Orton and Spooner Ghost House. The pleasure of the haunted house, says Kerr, is the chemicals in our body, the dopamine and endorphins and the oxytocin. I think the pleasure is in hijacking the set response when we know we're safe and in just enjoying the natural high. Additionally, she says, we have fun doing these scary things because it leaves us feeling confidence in ourselves, because we've done something challenging and we survived. The same thing can be said about the pleasure of a video game, especially a horror video game, that sense of facing a challenging obstacle and achieving it, and the following feeling of catharsis in the achievement. It also belongs to a long line of psychiatric horror, with major settings including hospitals and asylums, and assailants being the patients imprisoned in those places, such as The Unearthly, Don't Look in the Basement, and Asylum. Chain sees asylum horror as portraying disabled characters as monstrous perpetrators of evil acts or vulnerable victims, and that horror's disability icons include the deformed monster, the vulnerable blind or deaf character, the psychotic villain, and the protagonist, often female, usually being gaslit by a man with significant power over her, teetering on the brink of madness. The horror genre isn't exactly kind to disabled people, since many famous monsters or killers typically exhibit deformity or disfigurement, a physical disability, or unstable mental illness. People who are historically more vulnerable to violence and abuse rather than being perpetrators, but established as a quick horror shock tactic rather than giving a character a more compelling motive. Outlast does do things a little differently though, by facilitating conversations and occasionally outright depicting the mistreatment and dehumanizing abuse of the mentally ill through its narrative beats and haunting setting, something that is only recently being condemned at large in our cultural zeitgeist. And though patients at the asylum generally make up the ghoulish roster of horrors that our player faces, corporate higher-ups, CEOs, and those in positions of significant power prove to be the scariest monsters our protagonists face. It is through narratives like Outlast that we are able to explore concepts of institutional abuse through the horror genre. Similarly, the psychiatric hospital setting lends itself rather elegantly to tropes of the gothic, and indeed Outlast replicates these same tropes. A fear of disease, a mad woman clawing at yellow wallpaper, a fear of isolation, twisting architecture often as dangerous as those that lurk inside, ancient prophecies and supernatural occurrences outside the remit of the protagonist's comprehension. As well as this, Stober interestingly argues that the entire survival horror subgenre of video games inherently discusses notions of the gothic through the lens of both oppressive, dark settings and similarly dark narrative beats. As well as this, she suggests that the gothic, through the lens of video gaming, operates as unique explorations of the importance of death and tragedy, both as a gaming construct and as a manifestation of the fears of a contemporary audience. She additionally cites Laurie Taylor's concept of the ludic gothic as an example of how gothic signifiers can operate exclusively through video games as a valuable medium. The concept of the gothic being a valuable facet of horror video gaming brings a level of legitimacy to the medium by aligning it with a long literary history, most of which belonging to what many deem as the literary canon. And more importantly for this essay, there's been a long academic history on reading the gothic canon as directly interacting with notions of queer sexuality. Put rather poetically into Laney, or the reverse of the medal, queer gothic is likened to that mighty love which maddens one to crime, intricately connecting this iteration of queer horror to the aesthetics of the gothic and criminal madness.
Which finally leads me to this essay's topic.
In this essay, I will be examining how Outlast Whistleblower uses perhaps problematic depictions and representations of explicit queerness from the lens of the gothic and wide horror theory as a means of facilitating visions of horror, both in regards to queer sexuality and gender theory.
So radiantly beautiful that my husband can't help being as proud of me as I am of him.
Outlast Whistleblower tells the story of Murkoff software engineer Waylon Park and his dangerous journey through Mount Massive after he is falsely committed to the asylum for blowing the whistle on his company's medical malpractice. Though it was originally a DLC of the original game, offering a new and interesting perspective of the events of Outlast, to many, including myself, Whistleblower is just as successful at delivering a compelling plot and successful scares as the other games in the franchise. Part of the reason Whistleblower is particularly relevant in this essay's topic, though, is through its silent characterization of its protagonist, and how often that characterization is relevant to concepts of queer theory in regards to gender study. From the beginning of both games, the player already understands that neither Miles or Waylon are the kinds of male protagonists that we've seen before when we learn that they cannot fight back. Unlike, for example, Isaac Clarke in Dead Space, Chris Redfield in Resident Evil, or even Harry Mason in Silent Hill. Such a concept isn't new to horror video gaming. In fact, minimizing, obscuring, or simply doing away with the player's capability for combat is often used in survival horror as a means of increasing helplessness and panic in the player. However, throughout the runtime of the game, the player learns that while Miles is regretful, even angry that he cannot fight back, Waylon doesn't even consider it. Any kind of anger towards his aggressors clouded by empathy for those abused and oppressed by the higher-ups that did the same to him. Miles fits associations we may have with a male protagonist. He's cynical, sarcastic, quippy, and aggressive in his notes, and, when not being chased by murderers, he works as a journalist who directly challenges authority, supposedly being fired from a reputable company because of this. Miles goes out of his way to go inside the asylum, knowing full well the dangers that lurk inside, under the presumption that he will survive. Often in horror movies, men are killed through their own hubris, their own downplayment of their humanity and just how dangerous of a situation they're in. While women are more inclined to paranoia regarding their surroundings, men are less likely to approach dangerous situations with reservation and fear. Waylon is different though, more sensitive and softer spoken, and even using some poetic language in his notes at times, working as a software engineer who only challenges his company when he realizes that people are being hurt. He's quiet, reserved, mousy to a degree, motivated only in the idea of seeing his family again, uncomfortable in the face of authority, and much more comfortable when dealing with computers or technology. One might argue that of the two, Waylon would be the one playing video games and not Miles. Additionally, Miles slams through doors regardless of playstyle, whereas Waylon opens and closes them carefully and quietly, not wanting to draw attention to himself nor make his presence known, aligning against previously discussed associations of men approaching danger with confidence. Miles doesn't often vocalize fright or pain, but Waylon does frequently. Somehow they even play differently, with Miles feeling slower and heavier and Waylon feeling faster and lighter. If we were to view the two through the lens of binaries, Waylon is arguably somewhat more androgynous, representing more feminine traits of the horror protagonist, while Miles represents the masculine. What makes this even more interesting, especially in regards to horror theory though, is that Waylon survives his ordeal while Miles does not. Now, I'm sure we're all pretty well versed in Carol Clover's final girl theory here, but briefly, the final girl figure is defined as the female survivor of a horror film, though the term is used in horror television and horror games as well. Clover additionally defines the final girl as being an androgynous figure, since through violence she masculinizes herself in her fight against her aggressor and therefore represents an Oedipal surrogate for the male audience member.
And though Clover's association of violence as inherently masculine is questionable, I don't have my PhD yet, so I'm not going to take that. For now.
What happens when that final girl is a final boy? Though there are a few final boys in horror, most replicate the rite of passage of the final girl. For example, in theory regarding queer horror staple Hellbent, which I have a video on, Elliot Smith writes that Eddie, its final boy protagonist, aligns himself with final girl theory because he has to masculinize himself, with his father's gun no less, in order to fight back against his male aggressor. But, he argues, Eddie misaligns himself with queerness because, unlike the final girl, his masculinization aligns himself with traditional expectations of masculinity. The same can be said for characters like Ash Williams and Paxton, who survive through this weaponized and undeniable masculine violence against their aggressors.
Whistleblower presents something incredibly different from the final boys that we've seen before.
In what is perhaps a more memorable segment of horror video gaming history, Waylon becomes the victim of an obsessive romantic pursuit at the hands of the ghoulish Groom, a violently monstrous man who kills the male patients of Mount Massive through explicit genital and body mutilation in an attempt to construct a bride worthy of his love. Though Waylon's conscious separation from traditional masculinity and masculine figures is clear from the beginning of the game, he is even called pretty by a fellow male inmate during his escape, both associating him with gay male connotations and female connotations. The combination of the Groom's domineering, dangerous masculinity, replicating an almost conscious construction of traditional values of men in the masculine, and his feminizing language towards Waylon places the two men as almost opposites, as explicit binaries. One, a violently misogynistic and toxic parody of traditional 1950s masculinity, and the other a more sensitive, perhaps contemporary representation of what manhood can be. After a confrontation that renders Waylon's sprints into a hobbling limp, his capture, combined with sycophantic love declarations and troubling promises of marital relations, Jesus Christ, I can't believe this game, is followed by a sequence of incredibly brutal cutscenes that show the Groom's true intentions with his bride. Waylon manages to narrowly escape his grisly fate, though, at the hands of an external and unnamed male saviour. Through the game, much of Waylon's survival feels as if it's out of his control, with him either being saved by male intervention or pure coincidence, rendering him as a sort of damsel in distress figure, a typically female role served by a deliberately feminized male protagonist. Women often find themselves as recipients of fairly explicit gaslighting in horror films. In psychiatric horror, this is done through medically oppressive settings with a clinical male aggressor capable of calmly explaining a woman's fake illnesses while she frantically defends her sanity. The audience knows the truth of her sanity, but in the canon of a text, the declaration of "I'm not crazy" is generally the first symptom of, well, being crazy. Lee Waynell's The Invisible Man dealt with this concept very directly through its narrative and instigated a large amount of cultural discourse regarding the treatment of women from men in power, as well as the degree of institutional abuse that vulnerable people often face. Whistleblower replicates this story trope almost beat for beat. After Waylon blows the whistle on Murkoff's medical malpractice and its abuse of its hospital patients, he is committed to the asylum on a false charge by CEO scumbag Jeremy Blair. And through the established context of notes and the documents through the game, we come to learn that everyone believes Blair's claims of Waylon's insanity without question. While replicating the often gendered discussion regarding gaslighting, this additionally replicates notions of the gothic, in which a hysterical woman is imprisoned and abused by a rational man who can claim her insanity with a straight face, perhaps even a degree of humour. Through this narrative, Whistleblower replicates both gothic aesthetic tropes as well as gothic narrative tropes. An interesting comparison piece to Whistleblower is French horror film Calvaire, or The Ordeal, a somewhat undiscovered gem of new French extremity. The film depicts Mark, a travelling singer, attempting to drive to a gig before his van breaks down in the middle of nowhere. He is taken in by friendly, if off-putting, Bartel, who waxes poetic about his departed wife Gloria, but offers him a place to stay and to fix his van. But of course, this is a horror movie, so Bartel doesn't fix Mark's van, and naturally comes to the conclusion that Mark is Gloria, and subjects him to violent and troublingly sexually motivated torture to absolve him of his impurity and make him a fitting wife. Alex West writes on Calvert, saying in the climax of the film, which follows a break-in from a group of violent male villagers that kill Bartel and briefly rape Mark, Mark has a major epiphany. His role on this earth is to be an object of desire. In a Christ-like gesture, he absolves those who have wronged him. Turning our attention back to Whistleblower, this concept can easily apply to its ending too. Like Mark, it is only when Wayland is complacent in his feminization, to the degree of even referring to himself with feminine terminology in his notes, a wife, a widower, one of Bluebeard's wives, and complacent in his role as an object of specifically male desire, that he is able to survive his ordeal. It is through Wayland's capacity for empathy, as well as his capacity to valorize those who would do him harm, and often feminine association, that leads to his survival. It is his opposition of stereotypical male horror tropes, of violence and aggression, and his alignment with paranoia and reservement, more final girl tropes, that aligns him, and subsequently Whistleblower as a whole, with renditions of queer horror theory.
And this leads me, rather appropriately, to the next subject of this essay.
But tell me, how do you know it's real love, the kind you can get married on?
In the latter half of Whistleblower, Wayland finds himself back inside Mount Massive, crawling around the dark in near silence, save a man, Dennis, a patient with dissociative identity disorder as we learn in a document, talking to himself about a man named Gluskin, or the Groom, with what little we come to learn about him being not good. However, it is only after escaping Dennis and descending a staircase into a basement filled with sewing machines that we hear the tonal shift for the rest of the game. We first encountered the Groom, well, officially encounter anyway, after finding one of his grisly art projects depicting a fairly harrowing rendition of a woman giving birth, and he is quick to make himself known. Beaming a ghoulish grin and loudly declaring Wayland as his darling, he then stalks the player, quoting pretty beat for beat romantic dialogue from Disney's Sleeping Beauty.
I'm awfully sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you.
Did I frighten you? I'm awfully sorry, I didn't mean to.
But don't you remember? We've met before.
We've met before, haven't we? You know, I've seen your face.
We have?
Well, of course. You said so yourself.
It may be just before I woke up.
Once upon a dream.
Though it seems like it's really
which actually says a lot regarding the Groom's actual intentions for his darling, but we'll talk about that later. He then chases Wayland through elaborately decorated hallways, singing 1920s show tunes and telling him how beautiful he could be if he only accepts his love. We'll come back to that too. Now, we've already established in the previous section that the Groom is a serial killer, and a rather brutal one at that.
But I think, through queer horror theory, we can easily reinterpret his representation in Whistleblower as one playing with renditions of explicit camp.
Let's talk presentation first of all. While the rest of the patients of Mount Massive run around in straitjackets, jumpsuits, or occasionally in the nude, the Groom is decked out in a dashing groomsman's tux that he presumably sewed himself, with similarly themed apparel staggered around his blood-soaked layer. Why were there so many sewing machines in a mental institute anyway? Medhurst defines camp as enacting outrageous inversions of aesthetic and gender codes, and the Groom's representation as a horror antagonist and a relatively serious threat to our protagonist's safety, who also sings show tunes, who also lives in a domestic 1950s wedding fantasy, who also has enough time between murders to sew himself several wedding dresses to just litter around the place, kinda outrageously inverts the horror aesthetic that we may be used to. Additionally, there's a level of arguable camp and gay coding to the extreme displays of masculinity that our Groom exudes, especially when we look at artists like Tom of Finland. Tom of Finland was a gay Finnish artist who is known for his hypermasculine homoerotic art, and he's often considered to be the most influential creator of gay pornographic images in the world. He took traditionally heterosexual and patriarchal associations of hypermasculinity and subverted them through the lens of explicit homoeroticism and gay sex, much like the Leather Daddy BDSM community in more contemporary gay spaces. It's through these kinds of representations of specifically queered hypermasculinity that we might reinterpret the almost performative quality of masculinity as a whole through a queer lens. Additionally, Whistleblower's almost fetishistic display of male violence aligns with queer visions of horror theory in the past. In discussions about Madhouse, a fairly formulaic horror flick from 1981, Harry Benshoff wrote, "Many of the film's murders are committed with phallic weapons, knives, pitchforks and swords, and the corpses of beautiful young women that the monster queer has killed are frequently fetishistically displayed within the mise-en-scène. Similar concepts are done through Whistleblower, with our monster queer instead fetishistically displaying the corpses of men, with an emphasis on a specifically sexually motivated mutilation, though surprisingly not a homosexual motivation, but again, more on that later, through the segment's mise-en-scène. The deaths that we are able to see are drawn out and slow, with a particular emphasis on a scene in which the groom penetrates a man's groin with a knife. This sort of scene aligns itself with a lingering image theory that I have in line with Clover's feminist discourse regarding slasher cinema, in which when a man is killed in a similar way to a woman in a horror film, the image we're left with is eroticized through a homoerotic gaze. Of course, we can interpret these scenes through a lens of queer horror as much as we want, and indeed the text does support these interpretations to a degree, but the groom's delusions do counter this interpretation, and subsequently perhaps my reading of his queer coding. Though his victims in Mount Massive are only male, he perceives every victim to be a woman, and his mutilation to be modifying vulgar attributes of a woman's body. Misogyny and transmisogyny. What a catch.
However, the argument I'm putting forward, and what I established a little earlier, is more interested in the groom's coding, and how Whistleblower represents visions of horror in the text, rather than the character's specific and deeply deluded motivations. So that's my justification. Back to the argument.
Now, maybe this is done to subvert our normally safe association of Disney-esque dialogue, of marriage and romantic pursuit, to something twisted and gruesome. A significant facet of horror theory is subverting associations we may have with safety and even innocence as something terrifying, hence the number of films we have based around haunted children and children's toys. Additionally, contemporary horror has been interested in subverting typically romantic tropes by taking them to their logical conclusion. For example, with Joe Goldberg's romantic obsessiveness being a means for his manipulation and violence in You. But I think that the groom's character beats are more in line with an explicit queer coding, sort of representing less of a romantic prince and more of a cartoonish Disney villain, which comes with its own heap of academic intrigue, caricature of a loud dramatic man obsessed with the concept of marriage and domesticity, but far less obsessed in the female bodies that traditionally occupy that space, since, as Whalen says in his own notes, whatever story he's telling himself, he is not making women to bear his children, he's making women to kill them. Sort of like a Gaston figure, grossly hypermasculine, rude, entitled, a specific kind of obsession with men and masculinity, and with little interest in women outside of fulfilling a domestic fantasy that he alone can control. Remember the Sleeping Beauty comparison earlier? As romantic a text this is on the surface, in a horror context, it may represent a form of inert womanhood, and womanhood that is easily shaped and controlled by a man. In fact, Whistleblower kind of represents a more authentic Sleeping Beauty, in which the prince gathers the first fruits of love from the princess as she sleeps.
And this is where things get troubling.
Now let me be clear that I'm not trying to say that red barrels are homophobic through the groom's on-screen representation. After all, there's a big difference between intentional allegory, that being a fictional character being a stand-in for a marginalised group, and unfortunate coding. But through this coding, Whistleblower represents a predatory and deeply outdated sort of gay stereotype as a villain, not only a creature of incredible violence, but also one with a massive amount of male entitlement and petty cruelty, and perpetuates fears that have negatively affected gay men for years, and still do. The gay panic defense is still legal across 47 states in America, and having a contemporary horror text replicate the fears this defense is built off of is retrogressive, to say the least. However, Whistleblower does complicate these associations though, by perhaps establishing the groom as a victim of just as much abuse as the rest of the patients in Mount Massive Asylum.
Be warned that this is also where things get a little more hashtag problematic on Red Barrels' part, so heavy trigger warning for some sexual abuse talk here.
The man behind the groom is a Mount Massive patient called Eddie Gluskin, who was originally hospitalised for a delusional psychosis that resulted in the murder and mutilation of multiple female victims. The document you find regarding Eddie claims him to be a frustrating interview subject, perhaps manipulative to a degree, telling the doctors what he believes they want to hear and avoiding difficult subjects such as his killings and, interestingly, his childhood. While he claims to have lived in an idyllic, Leave It to Beaver-esque home, the document makes claims of traumatically violent sexual abuse at the hands of his father and uncle that Eddie is clearly still traumatised by, because he supposedly reacts to physical evidence of it with bewilderment and then a fit of berserk anger. While little is known about Eddie outside of the delusional psychopath warped by the morphogenic engine, one might interpret his response to his sexual trauma being his toxic embodiment of brutal and violent masculinity. While this is by no means a justification for his behaviour, it does explain it to a degree. Because he was abused by two male authority figures and would go on to be sexually abused by the doctors of Mount Massive, Eddie might have adopted this persona of what is culturally perceived to be a perfect man. Charming, romantic, chivalrous to a degree, dominant and assertive. Typically idealised traits associated with masculinity that can turn sour very quickly. Because they do.
Cool.
Eddie's violent misogyny is not only embodied through the killings and mutilations of women, or at least what he perceives to be women, both before and after his abusive hospitalisation, but also the language he throws towards Waylon when things don't go his way.
Trying to be patient, darling. Heavier than you look. If this is you on the honeymoon, I hate to imagine our anniversary. You want to leave me? Fine. Go. You and the rest of these ungrateful sluts.
Incel.
Yikes! This ain't it, Chief.
If she breathes, she's a thought!
Oddly, this sort of language does reinforce the concept of a consciously constructed traditional interpretation of masculinity, though. Being polite and charming until someone, a woman, challenges that, and so to put her in her place, you have to whip out the slurs and slut-shaming and fat jokes, lest your masculinity be challenged. This is where Eddie and Waylon really counter one another, as I previously discussed, with Eddie representing a horrifically outdated rendition of masculinity, and Waylon representing a more contemporary one. I'm not trying to make excuses here, either for the character nor the text. People are abused every day, and they don't become misogynistic serial killers. But Eddie Gluskin is a character in a text, a horror text, specifically written with a traumatic backstory to explain, not justify or dismiss his behaviour and make him a victim. Unlike, say, CEO scumbag Jeremy Blair, who appears to just abuse people because he can. When we actually first encounter Eddie at the very beginning of the game, he is being abused by the doctors he once trusted, much like Waylon is at the beginning of his journey. Struggling from their grasp, he throws himself against a glass barrier, pleading directly for Waylon to stop the morphogenic engine and stop this, only to be dragged away screaming again. Combining this scene with what we know of Murkoff's malpractice, its well-documented gaslighting, and its supposed history of covering up sexual abuse allegations, correlates with my earlier discussions of institutional abuse, and additionally combines this with a very troubling fact of just how often this abuse can be sexually motivated, regardless of gender. Eddie, in this moment, is incredibly lucid and tells Waylon just how vulnerable he is, but Waylon is told to calm down and continue with his work. He is told not to listen to someone who is begging for his help. This scene in particular leads me to wonder just how legitimate these documents may be. Maybe we're supposed to question what's written down by these doctors, much like Waylon is, because what doctor in their right mind would show an abuse victim evidence of their abuse? It is that moment, shared with the groom who would terrorise him so ruthlessly later, where Waylon truly knows just how evil Murkoff is and what they are capable of. Eddie, in that way, is just as much a whistleblower as Waylon is, which might be where all those shippers get content for their fanfics. Now, I've made it clear in the past just how much I love horror and romance. I think the genres complement each other perfectly, with horror being able to reinforce the concepts of impossible, often tragic love, and romance reinforcing a glimmer of hope to be found in horror.
But make no mistake, I'm under no disillusions of just how terrible this situation would be in real life. But it's still fun to think about the fantasy, right?
I have a video on this too. I think Red Barrels are playing with this concept a little though. Eddie is noticeably less deformed than the rest of the variants, with most of his deformities kept to the right side of his face.
I just think you like him because he's got other things.
Call me out. He's tall, muscular, assertive and confident, and a snappy dresser on top of that. He has a tragic backstory and shows potential to be a kind of attentive lover, and yet embodies the innately masculine gothic rage of a romantic hero, like Rochester and Heathcliff. He also, if you want to get scientific with this, embodies traits associated with the dark triad, those being narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, personified through dominance, superficial charm, deceit, and a sexually exploitative interpersonal stance.
There is that thing about, like,
Simps.
if somebody doesn't express themselves very often,
Yes,
and then when
yes,
they
yes,
do
yes,
express
yes.
themselves, it's not.
Yeah. In short, Eddie is kind of a textbook gothic heartthrob, and Red Barrels really, really, really enjoys just how much their fandom wants a taste of the groom.
Or they want Waylon to. They haven't decided. Surprisingly, I haven't talked that much about fanfiction on this channel yet, So let me give you a quick rundown.
Fanfiction, often abbreviated to fanfic, is the practice of fans writing fiction about established texts. It's sort of what it says on the tin. Fanfic in its most common iteration was first developed mostly by women in the Star Trek fandom way back in the 60s, before the internet, and would be shared through newsletters and zines sent around the world. But it was through the internet and the popularity of the X-Files fandom that much of the fanfic lexicon that we use to this day, such as fluff, slash, and indeed the word shipping, derived from relationshipping, or writing romantic stories between two characters, was developed.
Now, I, like basically anyone on the internet, am a big supporter of fanfiction. I read it, I write it, and several facets of my academic study have been interested in exploring the cultural phenomenon of fanfiction. I think, calling back to my introduction, that fanfiction offers a level of legitimacy and validation to a text that might not have been so validated in wider critical audiences. After all, if a group of fans are able to read a level of queer subtext into a character, a relationship, even an interaction on screen and write about it, that to me examples an undeniable degree of academic legitimacy and intrigue to the text. I mean, what is queer academia but fanfiction with extra steps? But let's turn our attention back to Eddie and Waylon.
I spoke a little earlier on the concept of queer Gothic and that mighty love which maddens one to crime, so let's unpack that a little more. The Gothic as a form of literature is often credited to Oscar Wilde, particularly through his text The Picture of Dorian Gray, which also negotiated heavy concepts of homoeroticism and gay subtext, aligning the two concepts closely from their very conception. Academia since then has been interested in questioning the queer subtext of classical Gothic novels such as Frankenstein, Melmoth the Wanderer, A Passage to India, and Frost in May, and just how much of the classical canon negotiates themes of explicit queer sensibility. Whistleblower directly interacts with notions of the queer Gothic by giving us a Gothic setting through Mount Massive and narrative beats of hospitalization, paranoia, and isolation, as well as a classic Gothic archetype for a leading man. But through both its coding and its textual validity, these tropes of the Gothic are queered, and through this, the text is aligned with the canonical values of the literature that had come before it. One might liken Eddie to a Frankenstein-like creature, a classic Gothic storyline commonly reinterpreted through a queer lens, a man-made weapon embodied as a monstrous yet somehow desirable figure that represents not only the capacity of male violence, but also the capacity for human cruelty towards those most vulnerable. Therefore, through this association, one might liken Waylon as a representation of the bride of Frankenstein, a man-made representation and vision of what a woman should be, built from an explicitly queer desire, Pretorius and Dr. Frankenstein in the original text, that inspires both repulsion and wonder from her creator, whoever he may be. Another representation of specific queer Gothic and a traditional narrative retold through an explicitly queer lens that we can compare Eddie and Waylon to is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I argued that Eddie was a sort of Frankenstein character, but he is absolutely a Frankenfurter figure. While he certainly doesn't have the absolute pleasure and the bisexual hedonism of Frankenfurter, Eddie's desires of a normative relationship and his willingness to make his picture-perfect bride does replicate Frank's desires for a queered normative relationship, much like Eddie and Waylon's actual but deeply non-consensual dynamic, and through his willingness to make his perfect companion, be that the hyper-feminine Columbia or the hyper-masculine Rocky. Additionally, since Frank kills the oppositional and non-idyllic male figure of Meatloaf's Eddie, there are too many Eddies in this essay, when he gets in the way of him and his creation, this further correlates with Whistleblower. Meatloaf Eddie doesn't want the picturesque relationship that Frank wants, and because he opposes that, he has to die. Similarly, because Waylon doesn't want to be a subservient female figure for the groom to project his desires onto, he also has to die. But much like Frankenfurter, much like Frankenstein, much like Dorian Gray, and much like the droves of Gothic tragedies that have come before it, the monster queer cannot truly exist outside of the realm of his own creation. So, Whistleblower must kill its own creature through a scene of undoubtable tragedy.
We could have been beautiful.
So, to conclude, I must go back to the beginning. What do slasher movies and video games have in common?
They both incite moral panic, both are heavily legislated against. Both are widely financially successful while not being taken seriously by cultural critics and academics, and both are thought to only be attractive to teenage boys. The resistance to classifying new media, especially video games, as truly academically worthy echoes troubling notions in regards to prestige and quality in media studies, and brings about the discussion of what is truly academically worthy. Should we simply be restricted to texts that are only deemed as canonical and elevated by a film critic or academic? When marginalized figures are able to read meaningful subtext into these mediums, when we are able to recognize our own plights and struggles in the protagonists on screen, an undeniable nuance and importance is added to those texts and proves that they deserve a place in our cultural understanding of film and media studies. It proves that regardless of cultural canon, these texts have importance. Through this essay, I've argued that queer theory need not be limited to 16th century literature, movies from the 1950s, or horror films from the 1980s. Queer theory can be applied to everything, from podcasts and prose to blockbusters and ultra-violent video games. Horror scholarship can continue to use the very same theories that we use when examining classical texts to examine contemporary texts that are often ignored from wider critical understanding, and give them a value as works of art that may open discussions regarding the future of queer depiction through the medium of video games. Additionally, the popularity of sites like Archive of Our Own and Fanfiction.net, with contributors from every end of the sexuality and gender spectrum, prove that reading text through a queer lens continues to be an active fandom practice, and one that only enhances the need for queer theory in academia.
Cinema was once condemned in scholarship, but academics proved its worth and started an almost century-long constant discussion regarding the legitimacy of every facet of cinema study. Video gaming is still being condemned in scholarship, and I think it's time to prove its worth.
Hello, my darling video nasties, and thank you so much for watching this monster of an essay. As much as I loved working on this project, and I'm so happy to make something for probably my favourite game of all time, this was definitely an undertaking, to say the least. Be sure to check out my Twitter for more hot takes on horror and random ramblings. And if you like my work and want to support me further, you can donate to my Patreon for first glimpses of videos, the script of all my essays, and just to help me out so I can keep making these monstrous hot takes. Anyway, thank you again. Have a happy Pride Month. Please stay safe, and remember to always stay spooky.